Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Cradle-to-Career Governance Manual Review Committee meeting. My name is Robert Tagorda, and I'm chairing this committee this year. Today marks our inaugural committee meeting, which will be run according to the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act as required by law. Our plan is to end by 2:00 p.m. this afternoon. So I'd like to first welcome the other members of this committee who are with me today. Thank you to members Cochran, Payne, Soublé, and Van Natten for volunteering to serve on this committee. Member Van Natten and I are participating remotely as indicated on the agenda. So before we begin, a small note to members, please make sure that your cameras remain on throughout the entire duration of the meeting so that we can remain in compliance with the requirements set forth in the Bagley-Keene Open Meeting Act. Okay, the purpose of today's meeting is to review Cradle-to-Career's governance manual and provide direction and guidance on identified priority topics. I want to remind the committee that our work here today needs to remain within the scope laid out in the charter, so we'll walk through this during agenda item number 2. Additionally, we're fortunate to have General Counsel Julia Blair with us in the event that there are any questions that she would need to have answered. As there is much work in front of us, our aim is not to engage in wordsmithing. Rather, it's more important that we discuss overall ideas and concepts to carve out the vision of where we would like the edits to go. That's because at our second meeting, we can be more intentional about the exact language. So big picture today, high level, and then in the next meeting, we'll become a lot more deliberate about the specific words that are going to be put forward in the manual. Another quick note before we start today's work, I wanted to take a look at what lies in front of us. There are 7 agenda items. Our agenda, which is posted on the C2C website, specifically notes the agenda items on which we will be accepting public comment. Members will be voting on 1 agenda item, and we will open it up for member dialogue on 3 items. In total, there will be 3 opportunities for the public to engage with the committee. It's also important to note that we may be shortening the speaking time for public comment depending on the number of speakers. Specifically, if there are more than 10 commenters for an item, we will shorten the time to 1 minute. Thank you again to members of the public for your flexibility and understanding. It's 12:06 p.m. and I'd like to call the meeting to order and ask that Stephanie Gutierrez-Valdez please call the roll.
Thank you. Member Tagorda,
Present.
Member Cochran, Member Payne, Member Soublé,
Present.
Member Van Natten.
Present.
For the record, we have 3 members present, 2 absent. We have a quorum.
Thank you, Stephanie. With quorum, we'll now move to agenda item number 2, overview and layout of the governance manual review process, including key milestones for the committee. This agenda item will be presented by me as the committee chair. Okay, to start off for this agenda item, I'd like to refer members to the staff report that was drafted for this agenda item. Members of the public, if you'd like to follow along, the staff report can also be accessed on the C2C website alongside all of the meeting materials for today. During this agenda item, we'll walk through the layout of the governance manual review process, including key milestones for the committee. In particular, we will review select charter activities and key components of our timeline. All right, next. Understanding the workload that's ahead of us today, I wanted to take this opportunity, first and foremost, to just provide a little bit of background context for the annual review process for the governance manual. The manual itself states that, quote, it will be a living document which will be amended by the governing board over time to reflect the evolution of the Cradle-to-Career data system. Changes to the manual will be considered by the Governance Manual Review Committee at least once per year at the second meeting after the start of the fiscal year. Additional changes may be considered based on proposals brought to the governing board meetings and approved by the agreement threshold established in law, regulation, and/or the governance manual. So it's just a little bit of grounding for us in the work that we're going to be embarking upon. In the next slide, you'll see that at the November 15, 2024 governing board meeting, the committee charter for this committee was approved. And then subsequently, 5 governing board members were designated to form the committee. The committee charter specified 4 work areas that the committee will focus and provide input on. The 4 topics outlined in the scope of work for the committee presented on the slide before us, and they are as follows. First bullet point you see there, revisit the chair and chair election process and terms. Clarify procedures related to per diem for committees and subcommittees, as well as representation of advisory board members. Third one, consider changes to the advisory board recommendation process. And then lastly, provide stylistic changes or technical additions and/or corrections. That's obviously cleaning up the language in order to ensure that the ideas put forward by the committee is captured in the governance manual overall. Moving on to the next slide. For this December 6th committee meeting, our plan is to begin the review of the governance manual. Although we are going to begin this actual work of the review of the governance manual during agenda item number 3, I think it's important for us to have a little bit of a framework or structure first and foremost. One, we're going to discuss preliminary edits as outlined by the office in the redlined governance manual. That way we can start to see where the edits may take place. In our next agenda item 3, I'll provide a high-level overview of these preliminary edits. Second, we'll begin discussions and work as a committee to propose corrections, provide guidance, and share insights on topics that include leadership succession planning, per diem for committees and subcommittees, representation of advisory board members, and advisory board recommendation processes. Then before we conclude the meeting, I recommend that the committee appoint myself and another member to serve as committee liaisons. Again, because we're not going to engage in wordsmithing, there's going to be some follow-up work that needs to take place. So our role would be to collaborate with the office in integrating edits offline in preparation for our next committee meeting to ensure that we're adhering to our timeline. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So today, December 6th, about a month plus thereafter, the committee will convene again on Thursday, January 30. At that point, our task would be to review any of the new edits provided, including some of the offline work that a committee member and I would be embarking upon with the office. And then we would have a final opportunity to review the governance manual and provide any final recommendations, thoughts, or comments. As I mentioned earlier, I'd like for us to stay, we want to steer clear of the wordsmithing for today so that we can reserve that for that meeting on January 30, once we've got sort of the big picture out of the way. And then our hope is to wrap up that meeting on January 30 and bring an approved committee recommended redlined version of the governance manual to the governing board at our next governing board meeting on Friday, February 28, 2025. So for members of the public, you can see this 2-month process, 2+ month process, where we're starting review of the governance manual today, reviewing some of those edits on January 30, and then about a month thereafter, when the governing board meets, presenting recommendations that have emerged from this committee to the full governing board for their consideration and approval. Next slide, please. All right. It's important that we understand the cadence of upcoming meetings, so that'll be, discussed ongoing today. But first, Member Sublé, Member Van Natten, before we close this particular agenda item, I want to make sure if you've got any questions, comments, or concerns with regard to the timeline or our scope of work, please let us know. This is the time for us to engage in this dialogue.
Don't have any questions. I think everything's been laid out pretty clearly, what our mission and our task is here. So I'm ready to go.
Agree. Same for me. I think it's nicely put together, and I appreciate the work you put in on the front end to make this seamless. I think it's going to move quickly-ish.
I'm knocking on wood. Thank you so much. All right, perfect. Well, let's move on to agenda item number 3 so we can start engaging in the content of this work. This one is formally titled Discussion, Public Comment, and Possible Action on Governance Manual. After having provided an overview of this process now and with a clear roadmap, let's begin working on the crux of our objective today, and that's reviewing the governance manual itself. Again, I want to refer members to the staff report that was drafted for this agenda item. And again, I want to remind members of the public, if you'd like to follow along, the staff report can be accessed on the C2C website. To make this process as seamless as possible, we've broken down the amendments into 3 categories as reflected on the companion staff report. So Section 1 pinpoints stylistic changes to bring the manual in compliance with the Office Style Guide, as well as grammatical edits. I recognize I mentioned we weren't going to be focusing on wordsmithing, but of course, we would begin with just a little bit of stylistic changes to bring it into conformity with the Office Style Guide. Section 2, this one details recommended additions, clarifications, or corrections within the scope of work of the charter. And then Section 3 surfaces main areas of deliberation and choice points for member discussion. Okay, let's look at Section 1 first. Again, this one, as indicated on the slide, covers the grammatical or stylistic changes. Edits related to this section have been highlighted in the red line governance manual posted on the website. This section includes one correction to remove the ampersand from the name Data and Tools Advisory Board to ensure consistency with statute and the naming conventions specified in the manual. Okay, Section 2. Section 2 consists of recommended additions, clarifications, or corrections to the governance manual. Similar to the edits in the first section, the edits in this section have been highlighted in the red line manual. In total, there are 3 corrections in this section, incorporating corrections 2 through 4. Okay, so that's a lot of words there. So let me kind of highlight what these are. The corrections for this section, Section 2, consist of the inclusion of the chair and chair-elect membership to the Executive Director Review Committee, update the term ad hoc committee in reference to advisory boards, and the addition of amendment definition in reference to the advisory board proposal process. My estimation, the edits and corrections for section 1 and section 2 are pretty straightforward. And given the amount of time for member deliberation today, I'd like to yield as much time as possible for the next section. But before we move forward, are there any questions or comments from members just from section 1 and section 2? All right. Okay, seeing none, we'll get to the meat. We'll get to the meat of this discussion. Section 3. Okay, the members of the public, members of the committee are seeing the table presented on this slide, which is titled Section 3 Changes. This is where we're going to spend the majority of our time this afternoon. You're noticing 4 main areas for discussion. These topics include potential changes to succession planning, per diem for committees and subcommittees, representation of advisory board members, and the advisory board recommendation process. You can see the page number references on the table as well so that you can follow along. I'm going to point out a couple of high-level sort of discussion items for each of these core areas so that we have the context that we need to have a productive dialogue. So let's look at that first one, succession planning. Shifting to the next slide, succession planning. Right now, the governance manual states that, quote, all eligible board members who are interested in serving as the chair-elect will submit a statement of interest for discussion and a vote at the first governing board meeting of each fiscal year. The individual who is elected will start as chair-elect immediately upon election. Furthermore, the governance manual states as well, quote, the governing board will elect a chair to serve 2-year staggered terms. In the first year of the term, the newly elected chair-elect will support the existing presiding chair. In the second year of the term, the chair-elect will become the presiding chair. So this is the status quo that we're dealing with right now, where there's a 2-year term and the chair-elect supports the existing presiding chair in the first year, and then in the second year, the chair-elect becomes the presiding chair. So as members recall, prior to the August 2024 governing board meeting, and this is some context for us here, the office received no statement of interest from members, noting their willingness to serve as the chair-elect. So that posed an issue for that first bullet point. Because as the governance manual is currently structured, the model builds in annual turnover and leadership and does not contemplate the current situation where no members are interested in performing a leadership function. Prior to today's committee meeting, what the office did was conduct an initial scan of the leadership structure of other boards. And the office was unable to identify any other board that had a quote chair and quote chair-elect structure that necessitates annual turnover. Right. So basically the office looked at comparable governing boards throughout the state to see if there were any other leadership structures comparable to what we have at C2C. And they found that there were no other comps. In fact, most boards seem to have an annual election for a chair and a vice chair with no built-in mechanism that requires an annual turnover. So yes, an annual election for a chair and a vice chair, but it's not a requirement to have an annual turnover in the leadership structure. Okay. All right, so that's the succession planning piece. I'm going to go over in this slide the advisory board recommendation process piece, and then we'll kind of engage in some dialogue. So here, a little bit of context again. Previously, the 2023-24 Governance Manual Review Committee reviewed and revised the advisory board recommendation process. At the February 28, 2024 governing board meeting, the board approved the current advisory board recommendation process as outlined in the governance manual. As a result, this year was the first year in which both advisory boards participated in this recommendation process. Member Nelum, one of our governing board community engagement advisory board Member Nelum is one of our governing board members. He also serves as a liaison for our governing board to the Community Engagement Advisory Board. Member Nelum was on paternity leave during the fall Community Engagement Advisory Board meeting. Chair Payne had the opportunity to attend the October 16 meeting. During this meeting in October, a few Community Engagement Advisory Board members raised process questions and concerns. Understanding that there is a substantive conversation that the committee will need to have related to the advisory board recommendation process, I met with Chair Payne and with the office prior to this committee meeting to discuss options for suggested changes to the process. The committee is being asked to consider the following options, right? So that's the context for option A and option B as you're seeing here. Option A would be no changes to the advisory board recommendation process. Option B would be to amend the advisory board recommendation process so as to consolidate all deliberation on prioritizing recommendations into the fall meeting of the advisory board. This particular option, option B, would give each advisory board member the opportunity to submit one proposed idea in advance of the fall meeting, and then the board would deliberate during the fall meeting to prioritize 3 ideas from among the up to 16 proposals submitted by members. This option could retain the ability for members of the public to submit proposed ideas to advisory boards by following the sponsorship process currently described in the manual. This option would also remove ad hoc committee meetings and the pre-meeting survey that precede the fall meeting in the current process. Advisory board members would need to consolidate all discussion of the proposals and decision-making on which 3 ideas to prioritize for feasibility studies, all of that within one fall meeting. Okay, another note of context here. Prior to today's meeting, the office worked with LRI, Leading Resources Incorporated, to research the processes that other advisory board bodies in the state of California, what they use if they are charged with making recommendations to a decision-making body like our governing board. Their initial scan indicates that most state advisory boards do not have decision-making authority. Rather, advisory boards are asked to provide feedback and input to the office and decision-making body on various issues, such as administrative questions, community outreach, and data sets. So that's what, the initial sort of background research on this question unearthed, that most state advisory board bodies, they don't have decision-making authority. Rather, advisory boards are asked to provide feedback and input to the office and decision-making body on various issues. All right, before we begin with member deliberation, I wanted to highlight the proposed motion for this agenda item. This way we know the outcome that we are striving for. The office recommends that the committee move to approve the proposed edits as specified in the report, and then delegate to the committee chair and another committee member to work offline with C2C staff to incorporate any additional amendments proposed by the committee. So this is the motion that we are striving for. As we're now transitioning to member deliberation, I want to share that the office and LRI are available to answer our questions during our committee meeting. So at this time, I want to guide us through the discussion here and ask that the office take notes and do the screen sharing so that all members can see in real time what's being captured. A process that's going to bring some transparency and clear up communications to this process. It's also going to serve as our working document in the event that we have to continue this work offline after the committee meeting takes place. All right, so member questions and comments. Before we have the office do the screen share, just any sort of high-level questions or ideas from the members.
I have a question, comment on regarding the sorry, I have notes and then I moved on to another page. Let me find them. Regarding the proposal timing process. And I don't know that I fully caught what the reason behind that shift is, or the need to shift that. And then in thinking of the feasibility around putting potentially 16 proposals and going through them in one session does seem potentially like a lot. So just curious to see if you could maybe elaborate on the why.
Mm-hmm. Let me call upon some members of our office and LRI who have additional context for this proposed change. Anyone from the office or LRI who might be able to shed some light on the additional background context for the recommended change?
Sure. This is Marianne, Executive Director. I can provide a bit more context. So going back about a year, this time last year, the same committee heard feedback from the advisory boards and revised the process that the advisory boards used to bring potential recommendations forward. And then that process was used this past year. There were some questions that came up, particularly in the community engagement advisory board this fall, around having a pre-meeting survey prior to the meeting to determine which 3 ideas are discussed during the meeting. So there was some feedback from some members of the community engagement advisory board who wished to see that that discussion of different proposals happen exclusively within a public meeting as opposed to a pre-meeting survey. Other members of the advisory board expressed that the process of using the pre-meeting survey worked well for them, and streamlined the process. So I would just from my observation of having been in that meeting, I think there were different experiences amongst the committee members in that. That was for the Community Engagement Advisory Board meeting. I don't recall there being as many process questions at the Data and Tools Advisory Board meeting, which also met this fall and followed the same process. So these two options are essentially being presented as things for you as a committee to consider based on some of the feedback and experiences of the advisory boards this fall.
Member Van Natten, does that provide the context that you were seeking?
Yeah, it does. And then I have more questions, of course, right? uh, so yeah, I mean, knowing we are, as the governing board, we are now in as a subcommittee of the governing board, we are now in a position to make a potentially big decision on how those meetings are structured, knowing that we have differing opinions or sort of requests for how they are structured. That makes it challenging for me to know what the best approach might be, I guess. And so I really do appreciate that insight, but I don't know that it brings me further to knowing whether or not one big meeting with potentially 16 proposals is feasible, and also knowing whether or not that is meeting the needs of everyone.
Appreciate that.
I have a potential process clarification if helpful, Robert.
Yes, please.
So of all the topics before you, I think what you're identifying, Member Van Natten, is that this one is the one where there's perhaps the least certainty and the least information compared to the other topics that you have here in section 3. So one option that's available to you as a committee is to task our office with coming back in January with either drafts of, what's option A, what's option B, what's a potential option C, if there's another one, for you to use today's meeting to say conceptually, what process would you like to follow between now and your January meeting? What information would you like us as an office to come back and bring to you? Should there be a process, if any, for example, the advisory board members could submit public comment in advance of the next meeting, and we could encourage that so that you have more, you can hear directly from them. We could mock up option A and B. We could explore an option C if you think there is one. We could also provide a bit more detailed information, as mentioned in, I believe in the staff report, or that Robert mentioned. Yes, in the staff report, it says, that the committee chair, Robert, would like to ask the office to task LRI with providing an overview of the process of other advisory bodies in the state. So if today you can help provide some guidance to us as an office of what information you would need between now and January, or what process you imagine could be followed between now and January to help you as a committee come to some thoughtful conclusions about this, then we're happy to do that work between now and January.
That's a wonderful idea, in my opinion. Thank you for that. I think if I were to have more information to help understand the kind of the path of least resistance that meets everybody's needs, I would love to better understand more detail on the why, and to better understand maybe some of those differing opinions from the advisory boards as to whether they liked the survey or didn't like the survey, and whether or not that all 16 in one day would work. So, and again, if, or not again, but if you all have the ability to do some lay of the land as far as what this information flow might look like in other states, that would be helpful, I think. But I do know California we're kind of leading the way in this space with our number of boards and advisory boards. So I don't know that there is somebody to look to. So yeah.
I would be interested in knowing, from the advisory board's perspective, what is the more efficient way to operate? Because I could see a meeting where you're discussing 16 ideas just wielding along for a long period of time, specifically if a meeting is set to be a 2-hour or a 3-hour meeting. If you think about it, discussing 16 different ideas in a 3-hour meeting is probably not the most efficient way to go. And I would see why people would prefer, the pre-meeting survey. So maybe a little bit more background on why there was the concern about having something other than the pre-meeting survey.
Yeah, that's helpful. Any other additional context? So, Member Van An mentioned the why in particular, right? Member Sublé mentioned, whether a structure like that would achieve the kind of efficiency necessary to accomplish the work. From a high level perspective, anything else around these points that we might want to consider, have the office and LRI look into?
Yeah, I mean, one thought does come to mind, but it doesn't quite get it. It might be a little bit more in the weeds, and we could certainly discuss it further. But are there other ways, broadly speaking, to get to front load the information so that everybody's sort of preferences are met? I mean, when I'm looking at, for example, the old I don't know if it was May. I don't remember what governing board meeting it was, but we were seeing a proposal that was brought forth, and there was a lot of information. And is there a way to sort of consolidate it and structure it so that you can kind of compare apples to apples, if that makes sense? So I don't know if that is maybe a middle ground. So as opposed to a survey, or maybe even a survey, but another way to have the nuts and bolts so that potentially if it were a 16 proposal meeting, the nuts and bolts are there so that it could be chewed on pretty quickly. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but and I also from looking at, so putting on the data provider hat, knowing the information as far like the kind of the front loaded feasibility information that might help to streamline those conversations around those potentially 16 different proposals. If they may be really amazing, but if they are not even possible without major resources and major time, that information could be really helpful, I think, when trying to decide what the group agrees on. So I don't know if that's necessarily specifically related to whether or not to move it into all in one day, but I think exploring how others might do that would be a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm capturing from that is the tools that the advisory board would need to make informed decisions within the time frame that they've got, right? To be realistic. So I think that those kinds of considerations could be taken into account when the office explores some of these areas. Mary Ann, please.
Sure, I'm happy to. So I'll try to voice over what I heard here and what we're taking away that would be helpful for the office to do. And I think I can ask the staff who are taking the notes on the screen share, perhaps we can focus a bit on kind of these high level pieces in the notes that are being screen shared so that we can capture that. So one thing I heard is that you would appreciate more detail on the why were concerns raised, what does that look like in detail. I can share one more piece of context than that in a minute. So, but point one request of the office before January is more detail on why concerns were raised by community engagement advisory board members. Specifically, what was it that was liked or not liked in that experience of the process with the survey? The second is looking at other contexts. Member Van Natten, you mentioned other states. I agree with you. I don't know of other state longitudinal data systems in other states who have a similarly complex governance structure around multiple boards for this. So I think perhaps the other context to look at maybe within the state of California, looking at other advisory bodies who make recommendations to a decision-making body, where it may not be the same topic area, but perhaps there are other structures similar to what Cradle-to-Career has, where you have a decision-making body, the governing board, and then two advisory bodies that make recommendations to that decision-making body. So my thought would be, as we look at other contexts, to look within the state of California at other bodies that are subject to Bagley-Keene and California-specific things, perhaps. And then the third thing I heard was for us to explore whether there's any way the office can structure information prior to the fall meeting for advisory board members that makes it clear what are the ideas that are being proposed, what is the level of feasibility. And just a little bit of commentary on my end. In prior years, some information that I'd shared with the committee to consider is just the burden of asking our office to potentially do up to 32 pre-screen feasibility studies for 2 advisory boards, and the challenge that the burden that may also place on our data providers, to be frank, because as you know, as a data provider representative on the governing board, it's not our place as an office to speak on behalf of the data providers about their own data. So it would involve trying to pre-screen all of that in a formal feasibility study fashion would be a bit of a lift for the office and potentially for data providers. That said, there may be some in between, just information sharing around, by the way, this data point already exists in the data system, or to our knowledge, this data point is not yet collected by a statewide entity, so it would necessitate collecting it from members across the state, or here's how just initial reflections on ideas where the office can provide just some very brief context so that people have that information. I'm open to exploring that. I think it would be useful for us to consider the amount of time that advisory board members in the office spend on process in this whole piece. So those are the 3 things I heard is, number 1, more detail on why there were concerns that were raised specific to the survey. Number 2, looking at other contexts within the state of advisory bodies making recommendations to decision-making bodies. And then number 3, seeing if there's a kind of manageable structure the office could implement to do some kind of information sharing prior to a fall meeting on the proposed ideas that come forward. One more piece of information I want to share on the first piece of the concerns that were raised. At least one community engagement advisory board member raised a concern about whether the pre-meeting survey was in the spirit of Bagley-Keene, given that the pre-meeting survey essentially was a mechanism through which it was determined what 3 topics are discussed at the fall meeting and setting that agenda. So I did want to share that that was a concern that a community engagement advisory board member shared, which may be a part of the concern, again, of at least some members of the board, though others appreciated the process as well.
Is that a good, go ahead, Member Sublé.
I was just gonna ask, has anyone explored whether there is really a Bagley-Keene issue with respect to that? Because it is an advisory body and it's not like members of the board getting together, discussing and making a recommendation or decision of the agency.
I mean, I will just say that this process was developed last year and included legal review. So I'll just leave it at that. But I did want to share that the community engagement advisory board member had raised that concern.
Member Van Natten, Member Sublé, was that a good summation of where we want the office to go and would equip us when we get back in January to discuss this topic in greater detail?
Yes.
I agree.
Okay, so let's shift gears from the recommendation process. We've got some offline work identified for that area. And maybe go back to the first topic which is succession planning. Are there any additions or changes for us to deliberate upon with regard to the succession planning topic?
I guess one question that I had, and I know the existing manual talks about someone at the first meeting or in the January meeting, the first meeting of the board, submitting a statement of interest to be the chair-elect. And I've never heard of something like that before. It seems like unique to this body. And I was wondering if there was a thought process of moving away from something like that. You know, I participated in other organizations that have, you know, a chair and a chair-elect. It serves on the same purpose, but it just comes up that either the chair works with soliciting people to, you know, to step forward to be voted on and elected to that position for the coming year. So it's the same process. It's a 2-year process where that person that's selected as the chair-elect shadows the chair for the year. But there isn't a statement of issue, a statement of interest that's filed. And so I'm wondering if there was some thought process to moving away from something like that. And then we wouldn't have the problem that we had this year where it hadn't happened in the past. And then we get to the fall meeting and there's no one to step into that seat.
Yeah, that's exactly it. You hit the nail on the head there, Member Sublé, because you know, when the current structure was initially envisioned, I don't think anyone anticipated that such a thing might happen. And there we were, you know, um, completely in that very predicament. And you know, for context, as you know, just to amplify the point that you've made, other state bodies, they do not have this kind of a structure and therefore do not find themselves in the same succession issue. Chair and vice chairs typically would serve on year terms. In the event of a vacancy of the vice chair prior to the annual election of officers, the chair basically would make an interim appointment to fill the vacancy, effective until the next election cycle. And then in the event of a vacancy of the chair, the vice chair basically becomes a chair. That's a more standard protocol. And, you know, the thought here would be to move toward a structure that's much more in alignment with what most state agency governing bodies currently have.
I would just add, I think that's probably a more efficient process, and then we wouldn't in the future have this issue come up because the governing manual doesn't specify what is to happen when what occurred this year, right? You had to go on the fly at the meeting and say, okay, this is what we're going to do in the interim. So I think a process that doesn't contemplate this, you know, far in advance, making some kind of a formal statement of interest to do something, and just, you know, really being able to be flexible and you know, have people step forward. I mean, it would have been great at the September meeting or at our last meeting if you could say, hey, is there anyone that wants to state an interest in being in the position now, and then having an election with respect to that. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Member Van Natten, how about from your perspective?
No, I think I think that makes a lot of sense. I do appreciate. I think the research on what other succession practices are sounds like a really good idea because I don't know, and but I think we need to have something that is more flexible, and that also, you know, helps us not be in the situation that we're in right now.
Yeah. From the office's perspective, does that provide enough context for us to draft some language for our next meeting?
Yes, I believe so. So I'm just going to repeat back what I heard so we can capture that in the notes. So what I'm hearing the committee ask is that the office draft up new language for this section of the governance manual for you to consider in January. And that new language would move towards having annual elections for a chair and a vice chair position. no requirement that there be a new and different chair each year. So someone could serve consecutive terms if that's what the board determines. And that if the chair position becomes vacant, the vice chair would serve until the next election cycle. If the vice chair position becomes vacant, the chair would appoint someone as vice chair until the next cycle. And then we would augment that draft language for the governance manual with some additional context for you to consider as a committee on what other boards in the state do. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much for that. Let's move on to our next topic, which is the per diem for committees and subcommittees. Thoughts from members on this topic?
I had a question, and is it more of an issue of because if you think about it, the contemplation is that board members get per diem, and typically what I'm aware of is for the, in the day that there is a meeting and in preparation for the meeting. And that's a structure that I'm familiar with. And I was wondering what the idea of the change is, because no matter what, if you're a board member and you serve on a subcommittee, it's still, I would think, contemplate, because you are a board member and per diem is associated with you participating in the meetings that you attend for the agency, isn't it already covered? So I'm wondering if there's some additional background on what we're trying to accomplish with this suggested revision.
Marianne?
Yes, I think we're looking for clarity. Initially in our first 2 years, I don't think we actually had anyone request a per diem for any committee meetings. And then when the question was raised, we looked to the governance manual and realized that it wasn't clear in the governance manual whether serving on, a virtual 2-hour committee meeting should have the same per diem as coming to an in-person all-day meeting, for example. So we as an office wanted to seek clarity on whether committee meetings would also involve a per diem in the same way that a full meeting would. The one other piece that I'll just voice over, because I think it's important context, is that education code, so the Cradle-to-Career section of education code, which is referenced here, is specific that governing board members are eligible to receive per diem. And it is silent with respect to advisory board members. Now, because of the board's emphasis on equity and the hope to make serving on advisory boards as inclusive as possible, and wanting to invite families, students, and others to serve on the advisory boards, the practice that's currently described in our governance manual does state that advisory board members are also eligible for per diem, but I want to just be clear that our statute is only about the governing board members, and so the ability of the office to provide the per diem to advisory board members is a decision that the board has made and that we are aiming to do in practice. But I just wanted to clarify that is not symmetrical in our statute. So I mention all of that just because we do have 53 board members total. This is actually less relevant for the governing board because many members of the governing board are already state employees who would not be asking for a per diem anyway because they're being paid in their state roles to serve on this board. But it is more relevant for the advisory boards. And so there would just be budget implications that the board should be thoughtful of for our office if we're providing per diems for all the advisory board meetings and any committee meetings that they host, subcommittee meetings or things like that. This also connects back to the topic that you were discussing around the advisory board process of just the amount of the staff time and resources that are spent if we have subcommittee meetings for both advisory boards prior to their fall meeting. So trying to connect the dots, there are some connection points on this point to that prior piece, But I think the main thing we are looking for clarity on as an office is whether the board, like weighing the resources that we have and the practices within the state, can we have clarity about whether a subcommittee meeting would have the same per diem compensation as others? So that's the clarity we're seeking.
Because one thing that I was concerned about as I thought about it was the budget implications. You know, if you start adding additional people and additional meetings that qualify for a per diem, do we have a projection on what the budget impacts would look like? And are we already contemplating that, especially as we're entering the next fiscal year budget cycle? I always worry about the dollars.
I think that's a reasonable concern, right? Because we need a process that's sustainable for our organization. And in light of the importance of the fact that we've got, 250 plus,
Mhm.
governing board members and advisory board members that currently participate. One thought could be that the per diem and the travel reimbursement limited to full board and advisory board meetings only. And because that is that's a requirement of everyone that's participating. And that in light of other considerations and factors that committees and subcommittees would not be contemplated as part of the per diem process.
And even if you split it a little further, not necessarily a full per diem, but an expense reimbursement, associated with participating. And I'm here in Sacramento, so for me, the only expense is whatever it costs to put money in the 10-hour parking meter. So that wouldn't necessarily be an issue. But for others, I mean, specifically if you've got students that are participating in advisory bodies and something like that, every dollar and dime counts. And so if there is a way to explore, maybe not a full per diem, but somehow an expense reimbursement.
Member Van Natten?
For me, the question definitely goes to the cost as
Mhm.
front of mind. I think it seems like it could be quite a bit, but I'm just wondering is there a way to. So one question that comes to mind is, do we have a problem finding people to volunteer for these roles, and are they actually indeed volunteer? And then if we don't have a problem, that might help me think about whether or not it is necessary. But then balancing that with the obvious, the student space, I think is really critical, and I don't know that that's necessarily the same as non-students, and I don't know if that makes sense, but I wonder if there's a way to do just for our student members, if that's a possibility, as a sort of middle ground, because no matter what, we do not want the financial burden to limit our kids and our across the state from participating in this work.
I hear you. So what taking everyone's feedback into account, what I'm hearing is the office is seeking clarity to enshrine in the governance manual what our policy might be for per diem specifically for committees and subcommittees, right? And then the feedback seems to be, are there ways, there's some consideration obviously about the financial ramifications, but certainly we want to make sure that we're getting full participation and representation and equity. So are there ways that, while still achieving the kind of clarity that we would need in the governance manual, exploring ways of applying various parts of this in specific ways to address some of the circumstances that are at hand? is what I'm sort of hearing from the group.
This is
Marian?
Marianne. So I think what I'm hearing and what we can do is perhaps before the January meeting, we can provide just some summary ballpark numbers of here's what the office has actually spent on per diems to date, which again reflects, you know, which board members actually requested, which has not been the entirety of those. So we can just provide some estimates of what is the annual approximate amount that we have paid on per diems for the regularly scheduled meetings of the governing board, for the regularly scheduled 3 annual meetings of the 2 advisory boards. And then we could also provide an estimate of what that would look like if their per diems were also paid for subcommittee meetings, so that you can just have some ballpark numbers on that. The other thing we can go back and revisit is, I recall it would have been last May or so when last year's community engagement recommendation was about student representation on the advisory boards. And our office did an analysis of how other entities work with students on their boards. And we face some constraints that other entities don't. So for example, the university systems can either provide academic credit or sometimes some form of like scholarship, financial aid type of compensation to the student members of the board. And because we're not a university system, we can't do that directly. So we had looked at some examples of what other bodies do. And at the time, my recollection is that the best option we could find is the per diem option for student members, and just need to acknowledge the reality that traveling to Sacramento for an in-person meeting, depending on where you live, even if travel costs are covered through our travel expense reimbursement system, a per diem is often doesn't cover what it would take to take the day off of work or to be away. So I think we were just need to be honest and transparent about that. And then to Member Van Natten's point, we have had more than enough applications each year for our advisory boards. However, to the point that you raised, that's different from having lots of applications specifically from students and families, as opposed to individuals whose professional job is very closely connected to the spirit of Cradle-to-Career, where there's some where it may be a bit easier to take the time to serve in this uncompensated volunteer advisory board role, which is a non-trivial lift, right? It's an honor, and we so appreciate all the people who do the work with us on those advisory boards. And it is a significant time commitment without direct compensation. So that was a very long-winded way of saying we can come back with some summary numbers and a bit more context in January. I'm not hearing a clear decision from the 3 of you today on which way to go on this, but we can bring that back for January.
And one thing that I always get a little bit concerned about is you know what specifically the statute allows and how far we're making a stretch. And so I would like to see a little bit of maybe some, you know, bullet point type of analysis that we're not necessarily getting too far afield of what our statutory authority is with respect to per diems. When we start considering paying it to advisory board members, specifically because the statute talks about a per diem, about the governing board being able to establish a per diem for the governing board members. And I hope I'm not terribly paraphrasing the statute there.
The statute is silent as to advisory boards. It does specify the board can set up a process of per diem and travel reimbursement for governing board members.
That's our general counsel, Julia Blair. Thank you so much for that contribution.
Sorry for not introducing myself. Thank you, Robert.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. That's for members of our public. That's our legal counsel. Member Sublé, Member Van Natten, anything else that we need? Executive Director Bates, is that enough clarity for the office for our next steps?
I believe so. So we will mock up some rough cost estimates, and I also heard Member Sublay's request to have a bit more detail on the context that we have in statute.
Sounds good. Okay, last one is representation of advisory board members. I'd like to open it up to members of our committee to deliberate any additions or edits, revisions to this section of the governance manual.
Robert, is this really about addressing if or when a member shifts into becoming working at a data provider agency? Is that really what we're trying to address here?
I don't believe so. Executive Director Bates?
Yes, thank you. I think that's less the confusion that we're trying to clarify, though perhaps, that's one we just haven't contemplated, frankly.
Yeah.
So let me just take a step back. There are two components to this. I'm looking at this is page 5 of the staff memo. One is about the governing board's clarity around if there's a member of the governing board from a specific entity, employees from that same entity should not be appointed to the advisory boards at the same time. So I think that has given us clarity. And I think if someone were appointed to the advisory board and then switched jobs partway through their tenure to directly work for an entity that's already on the governing board, I think we would have clarity in saying, that conflicts and might require them to step back from the advisory board. Where we don't have clarity is taking the overlap with governing board entities aside, there's a separate statement in the governance manual that says that representatives of specific organizations can only have one seat on the 2 advisory boards at a time. So in other words, if you work for, this specific advocacy organization, that advocacy organization's employees would only have one seat across both boards at a time. Where this has become complicated for us, which I don't believe has directly happened in the last 2 years, but came close depending on when people cycled on and off, is that people move jobs all the time. So I think what we're looking for clarity on is, say there's one member of a specific advocacy organization that has a seat on the Data and Tools Advisory Board board, and a member of the Community Engagement Advisory Board who was appointed working at a different place changes employment during their tenure, such that now 2 people would be employed by the same organization across the 2 advisory boards. Does the governing board wish to make that something that would require that person to step down from the board? Would it be the member who's newly joining that entity in employment, or the one who was already there? It's just, as we contemplated the hypothetical possibilities, we were curious whether the potential representation of people who are working for the same entity on the 2 different advisory boards should require people to step down or not be eligible to apply for the advisory boards. Or if you'd put this in the same category of, like, we're aiming for, lots of different kinds of representation on these advisory boards, including people in different parts of the state, for example, and different subject matter expertise. Would it be something that you just take into account the next time you appoint people in the next round? Or would you want people to have to step down from the advisory boards or not be able to apply if another employee of the same organization that employs them is already on it? And at the crux of this is that, unlike the half of our governing board where people are appointed because of their employment at an organization, right? You're serving as the designee of the superintendent of public instruction. Advisory board members are appointed as individuals. And so this is where we wanted to seek clarification from the governing board on how much you want to put an emphasis on the current place of employment of advisory board members in cases where it's not about overlap with governing board organizations.
Member Van Nan, does that help?
Yeah, I don't know, I didn't fully capture that in reading, and thank you for that. So you are
it-
clear as to whether if somebody does change their position and become employed by a data provider specifically, they would no longer be eligible. That's clear.
Yes, we
Okay.
believe that is clear. What we
Um,
weren't clear on is just if no data providers are involved and we're just looking at within advisory boards, how much weight does the governing board want to put on not having one entity not having more than one individual serving across the two advisory boards being employed by the same entity, which affects mainly when there's a new round of applications, needing to be very clear with applicants to say scan current membership. If there's someone from your organization already on the board, please don't apply. And if people change jobs, needing to ask people to step down from an advisory board. So that's where the clarity would be useful.
and that's not clear. The manual right now isn't clear enough for that.
The manual right now Julia, correct me if I'm wrong. My read of the manual right now is that it does state that you should, people who are employed by the same place should only have one seat on the board. In practice, as we reflected on our processes this last year, where we thought this may come up, we realized that we need to be much more explicit in the recruitment and outreach on that. And to clarify, like this language is less specific than what we have around the governing board piece, like how big is that umbrella? If two people are employed by a large entity that has multiple different arms and different pieces, would that count as the same? It's just, it's a little bit less clear. And if the board wishes to keep this provision, we as an office think we need to be much more explicit in our recruitment and outreach to say, look at the current representation. If someone who's employed by the same place as you, no need to apply. And if you switch jobs, we would need to figure out which of the two advisory board members would need, like how to think that through. So we had a few hypothetical cases that we thought through this past year where we realized that it might be useful to clarify this piece.
The current language, if I'm looking at it correctly, and this would be in our materials, page 32. It's in attachment A. And the same language exists for both the Data and Tools Advisory Board as well as the Community Engagement Advisory Board. The language is representatives of specific institutions serve no more than one consecutive term and can only have one seat on the advisory board at a time. That's it. That's the language.
There's additional language under the advisory board section on starting at the bottom of page 24
Okay.
that says in order to ensure that this is Julia Blair, General Counsel for C2C. In order to ensure that the advisory board members represent the public starting in fiscal year 2024, a person who works for an organization or person represented on the governing board may not be selected to serve on an advisory board. And it goes into a little bit more detail about what an organization is.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Sorry, this is Marianne. I think that the language that Julia just highlighted highlights that section around the governing boards on page 25 has more specificity than the section number 2 border that you mentioned on page 32. The other piece that I think just would be useful to clarify is the language on page 32 implies that members of the advisory boards are representatives of specific institutions. Is that the language that you wish to have, or are advisory board members serving in their individual capacity and where they work may be part of the perspective they bring, right? they apply saying I'm a practitioner, or I'm an advocate, or I'm a researcher, but are they appointed as a representative of organization thus and such? Or of, the thus and such county office of education, or what it may be? Or is it that individuals are appointed as individuals?
Well, I mean, if we go back to the individuals can't be on an advisory board if they work for an entity that is represented on the governing board, I think we're conflicting if we aren't staying in line with that. So I totally hear what you're saying, like as a human, I'm not who I work for, right? And I represent many things, right? Like I'm a mom, I'm a woman, I am an educator, I am all of the things. I am not CDE, right? But I also work at CDE. So I think it's we have some language that kind of does limit what we can potentially do here. That's how I'm seeing it.
Member Sublé?
I'm kind of seeing it the same way as member Van Atten. And specifically looking at that language that's being highlighted on the bottom of page 24, top of page 25.
Let's see where are we beginning to land here? So is it the case that help me out. Where are we landing here in terms of recommendations?
I think in the beginning at the beginning of the agenda, it was like we proposed it as two options. And is that correct? One was to leave it as status quo, and then I forget what the other option was. I need to pull back on the agenda.
I'm looking it up real quick.
Yeah. So one was the no changes to the advisory board recommendation process, or amend the advisory board recommendation process to consolidate all deliberation and prioritizing blah, blah, blah. Oh, no, that's the wrong thing. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that
was it, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's for the recommendation process.
Yeah.
This is Mary Ann, if I may, going back to page 5 of the staff report. So for item 7, the last paragraph there, I think you've again, so option A, option B for this would be, option A is leave things as is. Option B would be clarify that advisory board members are appointed as individuals and their employment is only relevant if it conflicts with a governing board entity, being employed for a governing board entity. So option A would be leave it as is. Option B would be to clarify that advisory board employment is relevant only if it conflicts with a governing board entity that has a seat on the board, but not if it's with other advisory board entities. Option A, leaving it as is, if you choose that one, which I'm hearing discussion around, if you stick with option A, leave things as is, our office needs clarification on what we should do if an advisory board member changes employment during their tenure as a member. So for example, what we talked about before, if you're an advisory board member and then you start working for an entity that has a seat on the governing board, it would be clear that you're not going to ask the governing board member to step down. It would be the advisory board member who takes the new job who would need to rescind their seat on the advisory board. So we would need clarity if someone changes employment during the course of their advisory board appointment and another member of the advisory board is also employed by the same entity, which advisory board member would need to step down? That's where we would need some clarity around. Is it by like who's the longest serving member, or is it based on who changes employment? So I think it's just looking, that's the part that's not clear, where we're seeking, currently this manual does not consider what happens if an advisory board member changes employment during the tenure as a member. Should this conflict with a governing board appointment? And I think we have clarity on that part. They would have to give up their advisory board seat or a fellow advisory board appointment. And that's where we would need clarity, like which advisory board member would need to give up a seat.
I would hate to see the person that didn't make any move have to surrender their seat. It would just seem to me on a fairness basis be unfair. Person A is on a board and then changes their employment such that there is now a conflict. I would hate to see the one person who didn't do anything have to even contemplate giving up their seat. So
Your contemplation would be that the individual who has the change
right.
Forfeits the seat that they would otherwise occupy.
That's what I would prefer.
I agree. I also wonder if there's a way to have, unless the two agree differently, right? Like, let's have it as a backup. So
Right.
let's say I am the person who did not change jobs, but this new person would be a way better fit than me. I want to have the opportunity to let that person, like, could we embed that in this?
Yeah.
That's not too rigid.
Yeah,
I would agree with that.
So perhaps as a default,
Right.
it's the one who changes employment. But there's some mechanism that enables the other person to depart if there's some agreement or a mechanism by which that can allow, so that it's not, we have enough direction in case there just needs to be a decision, there's a default, but that there's also an opportunity there. Let me ask the office, would that be too complicated? Or I'm seeing a head shake from our general counsel.
I think there's a way. General Counsel Julia Blair, I think there's a way it can be drafted.
Okay.
I'm just thinking, is there a distinction between whether or not the member leaving is an advisory board member versus a governing board member? Like, are we more concerned with preserving the governing board membership as it is, such that even if it was the governing board member who switched entities, non-data provider, because data providers are statutorily, determined, but say it's a public member or another appointed member, and they switch organizations and now conflict with an advisory board member, would we want to have the governing board member step down?
Well,
In that situation, you'd have to, would it be have to have a substitution in with another governing board member?
Yeah.
If the governing board member had to
Yeah.
step down. So you might
right.
want to clarify.
I see. So if it's a member that was a governing board member appointed by the legislature, say,
Right.
who ends up occupying a position, finding a new position in one of the data provider entities, in that kind of scenario, that in the governing board rather than in the advisory board level, getting that clarified as well, right?
Well, it is clarified as far as I read page 24, 25, because it says that the data providers, because it's specific to like superintendent of instruction or UCOP president or their designee, that's considered different than an organization because that's a specific person. So you could have an advisory board member from UC, for example, without conflicting as it's currently written.
Got it. Okay.
This is Marianne. So capturing this discussion, I think what I'm hearing is that the office, if it's option A, keep things conceptually as they are in the manual. We need to add and draft some clarification language on what would happen if it's two advisory board members are employed by the same entity. What would happen if it's an advisory board member and an appointed governing board member employed by the same entity? and what would happen if it's an advisory board member and a data provider designee employed by the same entity. So I think this conversation, I think, is illuminating some of the complexities. And I imagine that drafting it up may provide some
Yeah.
clarification on whether this is, whether there are any other complexities. I personally would also recommend adding a clarifying definition of same organization or same entity, in the same way that there's language on that, and I think it was page 24 where it's talking about governing board members, because, for example, does that mean if there's one person as employee of any community college that no other person employed by any community college could be? Or is it just if you're all within the chancellor's office or both within the same community college, right? That this would be more, I think people, when we're imagining this, people might be imagining like a 20-person advocacy organization, which can be quite different from very large entities that actually have different arms. So the part I want to avoid, the main thing we're seeking clarity here again on motivation is, imagine I'm applying for an advisory board position. It should be easy for me to understand at the application stage whether I'm even eligible to apply for a seat based on who's currently there. So my recommendation from an operationalization of this is, as we look at what we've drafted up, let's then also look at this through the lens of, I'm thinking about applying for an uncompensated advisory board position where I'm serving the state. Will it take me more than 5 minutes to figure out whether I'm eligible to do so based on the rules that we've set up here, so that it's clear and easy to understand whether someone is working for the same organization or not?
That's a good test. It's a very good test because you're absolutely correct. Um, some of the entities that are involved in our work are so vast and complex that we need to make sure it's defined such that, again, if you're in the chancellor's office, for example, very different than if you are, a faculty member at a local community college. Um, so to have that kind of clarity, I think would help. And it would enable members of the public who are contemplating the advisory board application process to know whether they would even be considered right up front. So I think those are two good, you know, smell tests, if you will, right? As to whether the policy is going to be a sound one to enshrine in the governance manual. But I think the overall point that what I'm hearing from the committee is, yes, we want to avoid situations in which there's overrepresentation by specific entities. We want to make sure that it's captured in a way that is clear without it being too rigid at the same time. Tall order, but I think we can get there if we're looking at some draft language. Does that work for the office?
Yes, I believe we've captured that.
Okay.
So we'll draft up, here's what it would look like to keep the process as is, but add clarifying language. And then provide some thoughts on your gut check about, could an advisory board applicant understand it?
Okay, sounds good. Looks like that covers the 4 main sections that we had sought to look at today. Is that accurate? Let's see, we looked at the succession planning. We've got some takeaways there. We've looked at the per diem, and we got some feedback from the group on that. We just completed the representation of advisory board members. And then we had our initial discussion centered around the advisory board recommendation process. Looks like we've covered most of the ground that we sought to look at today. Members of the office, is that accurate?
Members of the governance team, please speak up. I think from my perspective, I think we have enough clarity, especially in then working with 2 members of the committee on the specific red line drafts between now and January.
Okay.
Marianne and Robert, might I suggest that when it comes to a motion, we may need to add that we're requesting staff to draft additional material related to the advisory board recommendation process per diem and advisory board membership.
Julia, maybe one way to make that clear in the motion is just to clarify that the first part of the motion that says move to approve the proposed edits as specified in the report, we can put a parenthetical there that says that section 1 and section 2.
Yeah, section 1, and so you could just say move to approve the
Section
proposed
2?
edits in section 1 and section 2.
As
Sections 1 and
specified in
2.
the report, and then on the work, incorporate any additional amendments proposed by the committee and draft potential language as discussed for the items in section 3.
Yes.
Hello, members. This is Stephanie, from Board Liaison and Governance Specialist here at C2C. Thank you for your deliberate discussion, very much appreciated. And I just wanted to confirm that all of our priority topics in section 3 have been discussed. Should it be helpful during this time, members can volunteer to serve in secondary to Member Tagorda in that committee liaison.
Who would like to join me? All right, Member Sublay, appreciate your,
No problem.
thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Do I see opposition from Member Van Natten?
None
Or-
at
No. I appreciate that. So let's, we've got a designee to work with me on this. Should we, where are we at in the process now? Are we in the motion? So we're gonna rewrite the motion here for display so that it's clear to the members of the committee as well as members of the public exactly what it is that our committee is going to be voting on at the moment. And it's going to reflect the language that Executive Director Bates had articulated. And it's about to get displayed in a moment here. All right, let's see. It's coming up here on the screen. I'm going to read the language and then call for a motion. Move to approve the proposed edits in sections 1 and 2 of the report and delegate to the committee chair and another committee member to work offline with Cradle-to-Career data staff to incorporate any additional amendments proposed by the committee and to prepare additional materials for consideration by the committee for the edits in section 3. Do I have a motion?
This is Member Sublay. I will move to carry that motion that has just been stated by Member Tagorda.
Member Sublay moves. Is there a second?
This is Van Natten. I second.
With a motion and a second, we'll now open it up for public comment. Stephanie Gutierrez Valdez, can you take us through this part of the agenda?
Yes. If you wish to comment on this agenda item, please note that comments should be limited to agenda item 3. So for members of the public that would like to make a comment at this time, please raise your hand using the button at the bottom of the screen. Please note that if we have more than 10 folks that would like to comment, speaking time will be limited to 1 minute. Let's see. Oops. At this time, I see no raised hands in the attendees. Giving it a minute. Okay, with no raised hands, I will close public comment at this time.
With the public comment now closed, we have a motion and a second, and I'll now ask Stephanie Gutierrez Valdez to perform a roll call vote.
Member Tagorda,
Yes.
Member Cochran, Member Payne, Member Soublé,
Yes.
and Member Van Natten.
Yes.
For the clarity of the record, we have 3 ayes and 2 members absent for vote.
Wonderful. The motion passes. Thank you again to Member Soublé and Member Van Natten for the substantive dialogue there on these really important topics for our governance manual. The next agenda item here is review of the next steps in the governance manual review committee process. So the next step in this process is for our committee liaisons, that would be Member Soublé and myself. We are going to work offline with the office and LRI to incorporate the committee's direction and input into the draft governance manual that will be shared with the committee prior to our second meeting. That second meeting is going to take place on Thursday, January 30, where members of this committee will approve the final version of the final draft version. And then that will then be brought to the governing board meeting on February 28, 2025. As we're wrapping up today, the next big decision point will be at our upcoming governing board meeting, where the board will be able to review the work of the committee today, and members will be able to adopt all of the details and materials. Are there any other additional questions or comments from members before we move on to the next agenda item? Seeing none, let's move on to general public comment. This section is reserved for general public comment, and I'd like to invite Stephanie Gutierrez Valdez to walk us through this item.
Yes, we will now open it up for general public comment. So for members of the public that would like to make a comment, please raise your hand at this time using the button at the bottom of your screen. Please note that if we have more than 10 folks that would like to comment, speaking time will be limited to 1 minute. Seeing no raised hands at this time, I will close public comment.
Thank you for the facilitation of general public comment. Let's now move on to the next agenda item. Agenda item number 6, future agenda items. During this agenda item, I'll open it up to members, followed by members of the public. At this time, members of the committee can request items that they'd like to see as future agenda items. Let's see. Anyone amongst the members with an offering here for this agenda item? Seeing none, we'll now move it to public comment. Stephanie Gutierrez Valdez, walk us through this part, please.
Yes. If you want to comment on this agenda item, please note that comment should be limited to agenda item 6, future agenda items. For members of the public that would like to make a comment, please raise your hand at this time using the button at the bottom of your screen. So please note that if we have more than 10 folks that would like to comment, speaking time will be limited to 1 minute. Seeing no raised hands, I will close public comment at this time.
Thank you so much. We'll now move on to agenda item number 7, which is adjournment. At this time, let me just thank everyone who participated today, specifically to Member Soublé and Member Van Natten for your contributions to this entire process. And in particular, Member Soublé for volunteering to work alongside me so that we can support the office in preparing for our next meeting. I also want to thank the entire C2C team for their ongoing support. Executive Director Bates, our General Counsel, Julia Blair, Stephanie, the whole team who's on the call this afternoon. There was a lot of prep work that had to go into this particular meeting. So in addition to the facilitation, I want to commend the entire office for working alongside LRI and other individuals to prepare the committee for this important work. Our next committee meeting will take place on Thursday, January 30. At this time, we plan to host a hybrid meeting with a location in Sacramento. So for members of the public who would like to join virtually, this option will be available to you as well. Note that more information will be forthcoming on the C2C website. So now I'd like to adjourn the meeting at 1:43 p.m. Thank you to all participants in this call, including members of the public who followed along. And I wish everyone a very happy holidays as we commence this month of December. Thank you, everyone.